I'd like to really thank Gillian Mayne from Queensland LRF for being here today. She's our knowledge topic speaker, so she's going to be speaking about the Land Restoration Fund in Queensland and the co-benefits. The Land Restoration Fund's a $500 million commitment from the Queensland Government to grow carbon farming in Queensland. I think it's been running since 2017. Gillian can correct me if I'm wrong. And the program's delivered 2 investment rounds so far with pilot projects and a range of engagement activities under the program. The Land Restoration was the first fund in Australia to develop a standard to recognise, verify and value the co-benefits that come from carbon farming projects, which is obviously very important to all of us involved in natural resource management. So I'll now hand over to Gillian and for her presentation today. Thanks again, Gillian. It'd be great to hear from you.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you very much for inviting me to present today. It's always great for us to be talking about our program to the whole range of people across Australia. We obviously talk a lot to Queensland people, but I gather that you are from a much broader range of organisations across Australia today. So thank you for having me. So I have been asked to talk today about co-benefits in particular. Obviously the Land Restoration Fund, as Rachel mentioned, we've been going since it was announced in 2017. We had our first round in 2020. We started pilot projects in 2019. So we've got a little bit of experience under our belt, but I'd be the first to admit that we are still learning as we are moving along, because we are working in a really novel and a really novel space. So today I'll just give you a quick overview of the fund, an introduction to co-benefits, and I'm actually going to do a little bit of a deep diving into how we go about valuing our co-benefits. You're a bit of a test audience for this, so you can tell me whether I've gone too deep and too far at the end of this. But it is questions that we get asked all the time, and so we're trying to get more sophisticated about the way that we explain how we go about looking at the co-benefits that are attached to the carbon projects. So the Land Restoration Fund, exactly what we talked about is our role is to expand carbon farming in Queensland. So the government made a $500 million commitment. The majority of that money is to go to on-ground projects for us to invest and buy carbon credits with co-benefits attached. So we've done that. We've got our first investment round under our belt, and our second one is almost finished. So we've well and truly started on that journey with a fairly large bucket of money. But the second component of our work, which is equally as important to that, is building market capacity. So we accept and understand that the carbon market's not an easy market to navigate, and so we have a range of activities that we take to work with landholders, to work with NRM groups. We work with the Carbon Market Institute, with financial institutions. We work across the full breadth of the marketplace in order to build capacity and capability and knowledge of the market. Some things we can't change, we can't necessarily change the complexity of it, but we can increase people's knowledge and ability to navigate it. And we do provide support through things like a rebate program. So we provide $10,000 of rebates to landholders who are seeking advice on carbon farming, as long as they're getting it from an advisor who's got a little bit of training and a little bit of background in carbon. So just mentioned our first investment round we launched in 2020. From that round, we've contracted 16 projects. We've committed to $87 million. We're buying $1.7 million worth of carbon credits over 15 years. I guess that the things that we're really interested in, we're interested in the carbon. We think that's really important, but it's the co-benefit outcomes that we've generated from those projects really important. So a lot of those projects are land projects. We don't invest in projects that are technology based. We're looking at very specific methods. And the point of the projects that we're investing in is that they're delivering some restoration or conservation outcomes over and above the carbon outcome as well. So under those projects, we'll have 350,000 hectares of land regenerated as natural forest, and the term Category X will mean nothing to anybody other than a Queenslander, but Category X land is effectively unregulated vegetation that can normally be cleared in the ordinary course of business, and we're pleased that 7,000 hectares of that under our round one will now be protected from clearing going forward, which is just that's for Queenslanders, that's a pretty big achievement given the history of land clearing and the angst there is around the ability to clear and protecting those abilities to clear. Our second round was much smaller round, $25 million. We are almost finished that. We'll be announcing projects in June from that round. We've certainly seen a huge change in the market over the last 12 months with the spot price of carbon going up and then coming down. And it's really changed the nature of the marketplace and changed the nature of contracts. And so another learning for us is we're going to have to look at how we get more flexible with our contracts as well. So we've got lots of learning to do. Happy to answer questions about what that might look like and a bit later on. But I'm very conscious that we're here to talk about co-benefits in particular. So co-benefits to carbon are the additional positive environmental, socio-economic and First Nations outcomes delivered from carbon farming projects. For Land Restoration Fund projects, they have to generate Australian carbon credit units. So they have to come through the Emissions Reduction Fund. They have to be registered with the Clean Energy Regulator. And then secondly, they must generate additional environmental, socio-economic or First Nations co-benefits as defined under our co-benefit standard. And the co-benefit standard is the key element to our program of co-benefits. It is really the methods. It's the same as the carbon farming method. It's the standard by which you must follow in order to be able to claim the co-benefits that are generated from your project. So at this point in time, we intrinsically link the carbon to the co-benefits. We're starting to see a movement in the marketplace where we're starting to see some biodiversity certificates coming out of the Commonwealth. They use a similar method to us in terms of how they determine value and change over time. And so that is a nice innovation. That's a pretty big leap to go from the carbon market with co-benefits to that standalone certification. So we'll be interested to see how that comes about. So why co-benefits? Look, one of the benefits of co-benefits, so we've already talked about what the benefit to government is. We really are interested in the environmental outcomes that are coming out of carbon projects. So that's pretty key to us, is the additional environmental benefits. But for a landholder or a project developer, valuing and being paid for the co-benefits can be the break-even point, or take them beyond the break-even point for a project. I think we all recognise that carbon's pretty undervalued in this country. And so by financially recognising and providing some revenue from those co-benefits, we are bringing forward more projects into the marketplace. And they're not just, we're not just paying more for the carbon, which we could do in order to get projects over the line. But to get those projects over the line and get paid that extra money, you've actually got to jump through a few hoops, and you've got to follow the methods that are under our co-benefit standard. But what we did see in our round one is it did bring forward a number of projects that probably wouldn't have been funded elsewhere in the marketplace. So talked about a co-benefit standard, a critical piece of infrastructure for our program. We have 12 co-benefits that have been identified under our program. Our environmental co-benefits are, I guess, the primary co-benefits that we see from carbon farming projects. But socioeconomic co-benefits and First Nations co-benefits are also highly valued by us as well. The standard sets out for each one of those co-benefits, the standard sets out the way in which you must go about delivering and verifying the outcomes from those co-benefits in order to be able to claim them. The other piece of infrastructure or architecture for our program is our co-benefits register. So once you start to claim co-benefits, we'll place your co-benefits onto a register. The link, and it's linked to your carbon credits. So when we buy the carbon credits, it's directly linked to the co-benefits in that way through our register. What that register does is provide some transparency of the outcomes that are being achieved. So once you go onto our register, once it's up, it'll be up hopefully within the next month or two. You'll be able to go into a project and click on the reports that they've sent reporting on their co-benefits. And the idea of that is that once we get to the point of selling our carbon credits with the co-benefits attached, that you've got an element of transparency about what's been delivered, where it's been delivered, and the outcomes that have been derived. So that's the architecture of the LRF. So carbon credits linked to co-benefits through the co-benefits standard and transparency on the co-benefits register. So this is where we start to get a little bit more technical about how we actually go about quantifying and then valuing our co-benefits. And I guess the most important thing on this slide really is the statement up the front, is which says that what we're interested in is how much change you make when you're using the method you choose to make change. So that's the carbon method. So we take the carbon method, we look at what change that's going to make, and then we determine how important that change is to Queensland. And I'll go through those two elements in a little bit more detail. Effectively, what we're doing is we're working out a condition change score over time, and then we're working out, well, so what? Like, you know, is a change in one ecosystem the same as a change in another? And the answer to that is no. It depends on how endangered that particular ecosystem is or how rare it is. And so we put a ranking score around that as well. So the things that we look at, we end up with a score around or an amount of benefit hectares. So we work out how much the change is going to be, and we equate that to hectares. And then we can work out a rough value for what that hectare benefit is worth to us. So here's a little example. If we're looking at the threatened ecosystems co-benefit, and you're using an environmental plantings carbon method, then we estimate that over 20 years, you're going to have a benefit change. You're going to make an improvement to the landscape quite significant over a 20-year period. Similarly, though, if you're using a soil carbon sequestration method, then the benefit to the threatened ecosystem is much smaller, and therefore worth less to us because you're making a much smaller change over time. And then the second element that I talked about is then measuring priority. So which ecosystems are we going to want to see that benefit applied to? So Brigalow ecosystem in Queensland is a sort of central Queensland ecosystem. It's very much under threat and under danger from mining. And there are certain species of vegetation that are really quite endangered in that area. So if we see change happening in that location, then we're going to value that more highly than, say, our wet tropics ecosystems. Even though wet tropics are still incredibly important, they're less at danger than the Brigalow, for example. And so we then weight the change that you're making against that measure as well. So then it gives us a bit of maths, and we work out, you know, the benefit score, the change that you're making over time, and we we weight that against how important that is to us, and we end up with a benefit of a measure of benefit hectares over time. So just as an example, and the numbers in this are extremely rubbery. Please don't take it. Anybody who knows Queensland knows that $1,200 a hectare in Brigalow is well underdone, but it is just an example. that in the circumstance, if we're saying we're getting 84 benefit hectares, then we've worked out that change to us is worth $1,200, and therefore we'd be willing to, per hectare, and we'd be willing to pay therefore $100,000 in addition to that project from over and above just the carbon. Very, very rough, high-level figures, but I guess this is just trying to give you an example of exactly how it is that we go about working through our willingness to pay for the co-benefits over and above. In terms of socioeconomic co-benefits, this one's very much on an individual project-by-project basis. The things that we're looking at are employment and skills benefits. I think almost all of our projects from round one were able to demonstrate that they had some positive employment impacts in their regions. A lot of them were able to indicate that they had benefits to regional economic conditions, and quite a number of them were able to demonstrate that they were going to have some diversity and human rights benefits as well. That's really one that you need to go back and read the co-benefit standard for. It's one that we also need to do a lot more work on in terms of working out how how we could standardise those benefits and find some better measures for measuring those. But at the moment, we just look at those on a project-by-project basis. In terms of our First Nations co-benefits, we look at a range of things, but obviously the highest prize for us, what we value the most, is Indigenous-led projects on Indigenous land. The further you move away from that, the less we're willing to pay for it, because we don't see the benefits flowing quite as strongly to Indigenous or First Nations people once you start to move into that scenario. So we are looking at those connections, employment. We're looking for skills and knowledge. We're looking for connection to country, putting people back onto country as well. So they're the kinds of things that we're assessing. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about our verification standards, but for First Nations co-benefits and for socioeconomic co-benefits, sorry, I'll take one step back. For First Nations co-benefits, we do our Land Restoration Fund co-benefit standard does say that you can use the core benefits verification framework from the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation, Carbon Foundation. And so that's a form of verification that you can use for your co-benefits. For your environmental co-benefits, we allow you to use the Accounting for Nature framework to verify your co-benefit outcomes. They use a condition score rating. It's a really well understood and science-backed standard. And so we really value those projects very highly when they use that Accounting for Nature standard as well. So once we've got a project and sort of looked at its values, then we need to work out what to pay for those. It's not a science, I can tell you. It's something that we've thought about pretty hard. We've certainly sought a lot of advice on. And I guess these are some of the things that we do look at when we're thinking about how to pay, particularly for bundles of co-benefits over and above carbon. Almost all projects have more than one co-benefit being delivered from them. So then we've got to think about stacking, for want of a better word. I really don't like the term stacking. I think bundling is a better term. And how much additional value is that are the co-benefits adding over and above the carbon outcomes? So if we start off with looking at just the carbon, we use benchmark carbon values, so to work out how much we should pay for the carbon. Those benchmarks provide us with a guide in terms of method and region. So we recognise that some carbon projects are more expensive to deliver in certain regions, and so we should be paying more for those if we want to see them coming forward in those regions. And then in terms of co-benefits, along with the benefits in the projects of benefit hectare value, we look at what government pays for similar outcomes through other programs. So we're looking at a government willingness to pay in general for those same kind of outcomes. So we run grants programs that restore landscapes as well. What do we pay under those? You know, we shouldn't be paying more for carbon projects than we're paying on grants programs. We look at the costs for the project to deliver that project, including the carbon and co-benefits. And we look at them and we think about whether they're reasonable costs and whether the price that we're going to pay for carbon and co-benefits covers those costs or not. Whether there are, you know, how much of the project they're selling to us, how many of the carbon credits they're selling to us. But generally speaking, we're kind of doing these checks and balances all the way along our projects just to make sure that what's being paid is fair, that it represents good value for Queensland, and we're starting to build a bit of a portfolio, which means we can benchmark one project against another. Takeaway messages, we have much more work to do in this area. We've only just started, and the one piece of feedback that we're missing is when we sell our carbon with our co-benefits into the marketplace in the voluntary market, what will other people be willing to pay? One thing I do always say is that the value to government is most likely almost always going to be different to the value to the private sector. And so we shouldn't necessarily be using what we're paying as a benchmark value for other investors, other buyers. These are the measures that we look at, but other buyers will look at measures differently. And so the ultimate feedback, as I said, will be if we, at the point where we're able to sell our carbon with co-benefits into the marketplace. So I'll leave it there and very happy to take questions. I appreciate there was a lot of information there to take in. And I'm sure you've got many questions to ask as well. So happy to take those questions.
Thanks so much, Gillian. That was really interesting. And as you said, there's a lot of detail to take in. If you could just unshare your screen.
Yeah,
I'll be able to. If you can do that on your little screen.
That's it. I was looking for the button. Thank you.
See what I did earlier today and share your emails with everyone. So I'm not sure. Did anyone have a first question for Gillian? Because if you don't, then I do, but I can see at least people's hands now. The question that I was thinking about during the time I spoke while you're talking, Gillian, was, and you mentioned one of the methods, but what methods are you looking, I suppose, have been most supported under the LRF? The ERF methods, which ones have been used most?
So that's a difficult question. Let me look at my map that I had here. I think we'll find, just because it's the way that the marketplace is at the moment, that there's still a lot of human-induced regeneration projects around and Savannah Fire projects around. But in actual fact, I think in our first investment round, we funded projects under, I think, 6 or 7 different methods, including environmental plantings. And in terms of the ones that derive the most co-benefit outcomes, it would be those environmental plantings projects, simply for the fact that you are starting from a base of almost nothing. And particularly where they are environmental plantings that use native species and mixed native species, we just get such fantastic co-benefit threatened species, threatened ecosystem outcomes from those projects. And they're very expensive projects, but the co-benefits are fabulous from them.
Thanks for that. I see Chris Norman has his yellow hand up. Chris?
Hi, Chris.
Thanks, Rach. And thanks, Gillian, for making the time today. Appreciate that. Some work that we have done in Queensland a little bit and elsewhere across the country too is around aggregation. Gillian, like an issue with smaller landholders. I wonder if you can update us with the work you've been doing around the potential for aggregation.
Yeah, aggregation's a tricky one because so I guess what we understand in terms of aggregation, I'll give you a couple of things that I've come across in terms of aggregation. What we understand is that there needs to be a really quite strong driver outside of just carbon benefits, carbon for aggregation to happen. So there needs to be a common purpose that's beyond just the carbon. So we identify carbon. We understand that there are economies of scale, and there are some areas, particularly in Queensland, where along the eastern seaboard, where land holdings are generally quite small and not meeting the economies of scale required to get a carbon project across the line. So in those circumstances, you have to have a really strong connection between the landholders in order to make aggregation viable. I have to say I haven't seen a particularly good example of it yet. I haven't seen that happen because the cooperation needs to be so strong, which is why the brokers really have their place in the marketplace as well. But I think what will be coming up that will require a fair degree of coordination and cooperation is projects under the blue carbon method. So new legislative method last year from the Commonwealth. Generally speaking, blue carbon projects are about reintroducing water onto land that has been held back by bunds or other temporary structures. Now, generally speaking, removing one of those structures doesn't just impact your land, it will impact a whole range of land. And so we think aggregation is going to be incredibly important for that. One of the projects we've been working on in Queensland is with the Sunshine Coast Council around the Blue Heart, and I'd encourage you to go Google that project if you can. That's a really great example of where blue carbon will probably come into its own over time as a transition strategy, helping landholders move from existing agricultural or other sort of semi-rural land uses. And as climate change comes along and their land sort of becomes more and more wet, the mangroves will start to grow back, and the blue carbon the carbon that's sequestered in those landscapes is huge. But without a coordinated effort across that whole project area, I think that it won't be possible to get a viable carbon project up. So that's one of the areas we're working in to see what type of model might work in that circumstance to bring those landholders together to get a mutual outcome, a mutual gain.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Gillian. Have we got some more questions from people?
I can see a hand up from Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian. You may have already answered this in your presentation, but just confirming, landholders have an agreement through with the Clean Energy Regulator or through the Emissions Reduction Fund, and then two agreements, then one with the Queensland Government.
Yep.
And that agreement with the Queensland Government, is that attached to title?
No, it's not attached to title. It's a good question though, because I think there's still a lot of work to do around title and carbon. So the agreements, when you talk about agreements, so we have the purchase contract. So the agreement they have with the Commonwealth is really just about registering the project and running the project and having the carbon credits accredited to it. So there's no buy. So the Commonwealth's not buying the carbon from them, we're buying the carbon in that circumstance there. In terms of titles, the carbon project itself will have probably a number of complex agreements between the landholder, the broker, and subsequent buyer of carbon as well. So it is complex, but we are seeing properties being sold with carbon projects in place. So it is possible to transfer them, and there doesn't seem to be too many impediments to them not being on title at the moment.
Thank you.
Just on that, Gillian, if you've got time, because that was the question I had down as well, was in terms of the co-benefits and I suppose risks to the projects. So under the ERF, if you have an environmental planting and it gets burned in a bushfire, then you would be obliged to replant that area that was impacted. I was just wondering, how are the risks managed under the LRF? Like, are you potentially liable to repay money if there's an adverse environmental impact on a planting or something to the LRF pool as well as the carbon farming pool, or sort of how does that work?
Look, yeah, it's a good question and we haven't struck it yet, so I guess time will tell. But I guess under the ERF it's slightly different in that, yes, you can replant, but quite often if you've got a carbon off-take agreement with the Commonwealth, you can source that from somewhere else. We don't allow that under the LRF, so the co-benefits come from that project. Similar to carbon, though, we pay on delivery for co-benefits under the LRF. So if you aren't able to demonstrate your co-benefit outcomes, then you just don't get your next payment.
Thanks for that, Gillian. Sorry, Lee's coming again, I see.
Yeah, no, I can keep going on the mechanics of it. And so is there scheduled payments then? So if the Queensland Government are the owner of the AQs, then I'm guessing the Queensland Government get paid over time.
Yeah.
Do you mirror that with your agreements with the landholders?
So our agreements are with whoever the project owner is. So we're buying from the broker or whoever's pitching us a project. It could be the landholder. There are regular payments over time. We do have a slightly strange contract that I wasn't going to go into because it's quite complex, but we do have an upfront payment, and this is all about the government's role in de-risking projects, bringing them forward, making them viable, and so that we do have an upfront payment, but that's we hold back payment for our queues in lieu of paying that off over time. The co-benefits are linked to the ACQs, but in some circumstances, we have contracts that sort of spread that over time as well. So it is quite complex. I no doubt we will have some contracting issues over time. We will just sort those out as we come through. What we have recognised is that the market is moving to a stage where it doesn't want fixed price contracts anymore too. So we are thinking about what happens in the next contract round as well. And thinking about whether it's how flexible we can get with our contracts in terms of benefit sharing. The spot price got everybody in a lather last year. It's got them less in the lather now, but it is kind of the way that the market's moving. Is they want flexibility and they want to be able to value share over time. So we're looking at how we can do that.
Thanks heaps for that, Gillian. I know you've got to head off. So if you would like to head off now, I'll just thank you so much for coming and explaining it to us today. It was really great to have you along and understand some of the mechanics of it. And we might get you or somebody from your team to come back another time and maybe talk us through a few specific project examples, because I'd love to see how some of these co-benefits are being delivered on the ground.
Yeah, great idea, actually. I think a couple of case studies would be really great, and happy for my team to come along any time to talk you through what we've learned. And thank you for inviting me today. Really appreciate it.